Welcome to the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series. This is the 7th offering in this series, and we have 5 more months to go. Today, we're in for a treat. We have a talk called An Adaptation in Action, How to Resist, Accept, or Direct Forest Change on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. Our speaker today is Dawn Magness, a landscape ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. As you can see, there are some choices to set your audio settings, and there's various different opportunities for you to change that and do what seems to work for you. This series is a partnership of a number of different groups. Within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications, and Migratory Bird Programs, and the National Conservation Training Center are joining with the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, NIACS, in sponsoring the webinar series. If you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, you should contact Jeff Horan at the email listed there. And if you have any problems with your registration or technical issues, you can contact me or you can contact Amanda Cucci. But at this point, I think it will be important just to see if we can work them out through me. The CEU credits are available from 2 different professional organizations, the Wildlife Society and the Society for American Foresters. If you're interested in American Society of American Forester credits, please contact me and I'll tell you some of the information I need to collect. The Wildlife Society credits are all self-reporting. This is a little disclaimer. This product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. We are going to be using the chat to communicate. There will be an opportunity to ask questions both in the middle of the talk. We're going to pause, but also at the end, we're going to answer the bulk of the questions. This webinar is being recorded live, and it will be posted over the next couple of weeks at the link indicated in your chat. That's the NIACS link. Forestadaptation.org is the NIACS link where all 7 of these webinars are posted. You're going to be using your chat function, and please type in your questions and select everyone in the drop-down menu and then enter submit, and your question will be posted. You have the ability to change your view, and we might recommend the side-by-side gallery, but you have some choices. Kurt, you're up.
Thank you very much, Jim. I really appreciate it. I'm honored today to introduce our speaker for the 7th webinar in the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series. My name is Kurt Johnson. I'm a wildlife biologist in the Science Applications program of the Fish and Wildlife Service in our headquarters. And I was very proud to be part of the group that helped develop this webinar series. This 12-part series is really intended to tell a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife. Earlier webinars in the series examined forest ecosystems and their composition and structure under a changing climate and the influence on wildlife populations and carbon dynamics. This webinar and future webinars will also share tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscape and stand scales. Next slide, please. Today's webinar by Dawn Magness is Adaptation in Action: How to Resist, Accept, or Direct Forest Change on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, Alaska. Next, please. I'm pleased to introduce Dawn Magness. I've worked with Dawn for a number of years in the climate realm within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's been a pleasure to work with her all this time. Dawn has spent more than 20 years working on how the national wildlife system can respond to climate change impacts. Most recently, she helped develop the Resist, Accept, Direct, RAD framework for decision making, and is working with Alaska refuges to help implement climate change adaptation. Dawn obtained her PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Alaska, her MS in fish and wildlife science at Texas A&M University, and a BA in biology at the University of Montana. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Dawn and let her begin her presentation. Dawn, take it away.
All right, thanks, Kurt. I'm just gonna spend a second getting this started. All right, how does that look, right? Yeah, okay, so thank you, Kurt, and thanks to the hosts and everybody who joined us today. I'm going to begin with a roadmap of where this talk is going. I'll start with some background on the refuge system and climate change on the Kenai Refuge in particular. Then I'm going to ground our future choices into the big whys of wildlife refugia or strongholds in biodiversity. I'll end by attempting to operationalize these big whys for the Kenai and set the stage for a discussion about what research and pilot projects will be needed to move forward. And just a warning for everybody, this talk's exploratory. So we, meaning myself and other staff on the Kenai and others at the Alaska regional level, don't have it all figured out. And so we appreciate everyone who's willing to share their time and listen, because we need to bounce these ideas off of others in order to get insights and reactions. So I'm starting to come to this place where I believe adaptation requires collective genius. In her book about leadership for innovation, Linda Hill talks about how some problems and situations are so complex that they cannot be solved by one person alone. They require that we weave individual slices of genius into a collective genius. So all of you are going to help us move this forward. For those of you who are unfamiliar, National Wildlife Refuges are federally managed lands. We sit in the Department of Interior and are part of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I couldn't fit all of our programs onto the slide, but the National Wildlife Refuge System is one of 13 programs overseen by our current director, Martha Williams. We have around 9,000 employees stationed in national, regional, and field offices. And I'm very proud of the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Prior to the 1900s, wildlife in the United States was seen as an unending resource that did not need protection. So the first European settlers harvested without limit for markets, and Americans saw the extinction of the passenger pigeon. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt established Pelican Island as the first national wildlife refuge to preserve as a preserve and breeding ground for native birds, whose populations were being decimated to provide feathers for the fashion industry. Paul Krogel, pictured on the left, was hired by Audubon as the first warden of Pelican Island. This first refuge gave other presidents in Congress a precedent that allowed them to put more land into the federal estate for wildlife through executive orders and legislation. From 1903 to 1909, the so-called crazy quilt of refuges grew to 51 bird and 4 big game reserves. The 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the 1934 Duck Stamp Act, and the 1937 Pittman-Robertson Act focused efforts and provided funding to protect birds along the flyways. So refuges were on the leading edge of continental conservation efforts. Other species were protected too, and today there's refuges with a range of purposes, including bird sanctuary, game species, waterfowl protection, and endangered species protection. I work on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, which was originally established in 1941 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as the Kenai National Moose Range, at the request of big game hunters and guides to protect the giant Kenai moose. So Dave Spencer, our first manager, is pictured in the middle picture with his great-grandmother and his amphibious Widgeon aircraft. Spencer worked to control poaching of moose and oversaw the oil and gas development that began after leasing was opened in 1956. The Kenai Moose Range became the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in 1980 with the passing of ANILCA. 16 Alaskan refuges, including Yukon Flats and Arctic, which are pictured here, were established. Alaskan refuges are huge, ranging from 1 to 20 million acres in size. The intention of Congress at establishment was to protect functioning natural landscapes. Alaskan refuges, their purpose was to conserve fish and wildlife populations and habitat in their natural diversity, to fulfill international fish and wildlife treaty obligations, and to ensure water quality and necessary water quantity. Congress also gave the general purpose of enduring continued subsistence used by local residents, with the exception of Kenai, which has the specific purpose of providing wildlife-dependent recreation while still falling under the provision of Title VIII of ANILCA for meeting subsistence uses. At the national scale, the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997 unified all 566 refuges into a conservation system with a mission to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of the fish, wildlife, and plant species and their habitats within the United States for the benefit of present and future generations of America. In this act, establishment purposes are still primary. Other legislation, such as the Wilderness Act of 1964 and the Endangered Species Act, also guide and constrain refuge management. The Kenai Refuge is just under 2 million acres. So this is small when compared to other refuges in Alaska, but large in the overall refuge system. The Kenai Refuge is in South Central Alaska on the 6 million acre Kenai Peninsula. We are about 3.5 hours driving around Turnagain Arm from Anchorage. And you have to drive around Turnagain Arm and over the Kenai Mountains. Much of the Sterling Highway follows the Kenai River, pictured here, from its headwaters to the mouth near the refuge headquarters in Soldana. The refuge is very diverse because of the topographic diversity and coastal effects. It spans the southern extent of the boreal forest biome and the northern extent of the Pacific Maritime Rainforest biome. Hybridization is common here amongst boreal and temperate rainforest species. For example, boreal white and maritime Sitka spruce hybridize to form Lutz spruce. The disciplines of Western wildlife management and conservation are grounded in an assumption of stability. Refuge policy uses historical condition and naturalness, defined as using the historical baseline of European settlement to define what conditions are desirable. Climate change makes us grapple with the reality that ecosystems are ultimately dynamic and that we cannot replicate the past. The species assemblage and ecosystems of the Kenai Peninsula have been changing ever since the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago. And before that too. The past can inform us and matters because ecosystems are path dependent. But more change will happen in the future. Only trying to maintain or go back to past conditions could increase the likelihood of extinction for some species given rapid climate change. However, accepting that ecosystems are dynamic does not mean that we must accept all change. What if we considered humans to be as natural as any other species or natural processes? Though most stories in natural resource management depict humans as negative for ecosystems, we can intervene and be proactive to shape outcomes that create good futures. The paradigm shift is for our profession to define new values, rules, and knowledge that can help us define what conditions are desirable beyond historical condition and naturalness. We must, because climate change is happening. Alaska is changing faster than places at lower latitudes. The annual temperature on the Kenai Peninsula has warmed from 3 to about 3.5 degrees from 1969 to 2018. And annual precipitation has increased from 3.5 to 16.5%, depending on whether you're looking at the boreal or Pacific maritime biome that the Kenai Mountains divide. Many climate change impacts have been empirically documented on the Kenai too, including wetland drying and woody encroachment, loss of glaciers, tree and shrubs moving into alpine habitats, and surprising changes in fire behavior and seasonal timing. Shifting from assuming that we are managing stable systems to trying to manage for dynamic change can feel like navigating off the map, or maybe being blown off the map by climate change. So we need to continue to build a shared knowledge about what futures are possible. For this, we can leverage scenario planning to get to implementable adaptation. I think about scenarios in terms of the beam and the paths. So the beam is like a flashlight. It helps us to bound the discussion of what can be possible given climate change futures. I use the beam to look across the range of climate futures that vary based on emission scenario and GCMs. I also use the beam to find new or unexpected ecological possibilities that could occur in the longer timeframes of downscale climate models by identifying climate analogs to look at, by looking at outputs of climate envelope models, and by thinking about climate connectivity. The point is to open up my mind and think creatively about what could happen. On the Kenai, this has helped us to contextualize what we are seeing on the ground and helps us to shift to thinking about how the future might be very different than what we've experienced in the past. This graph allows us to compare the range of climate futures generated by different global circulation models, so GCMs, and the emission pathways. I averaged downscaled data from Adapt West to see how these climate futures look within the landscape context of the Kenai. There is agreement that the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge will get warmer and wetter. The increases in precipitation may be overwhelmed by increased evapotranspiration. Seeing the range helps us to identify the low, average, and high exposure climate futures. For natural resource management, we need to link these climate futures to ecological response, even though this increases our uncertainty. One approach that I've used is to map the climate space onto Whitaker plots. Whitaker plots map out where global biomes sit based on average annual temperature and annual precipitation. The 1961 to 1990 historical climate data for the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge are the black dots on the graph that has color. Each dot represents a 1 kilometer pixel. The refuge maps onto the boreal forest, and we have some very wet and cold places. I use the color figure because it's easy to produce in Program R. The black and white figure on the right is from the 1913 National Climate Assessment, which accommodates some parts of Alaska that are colder and wetter temperate rainforests and that fall outside of the colored Whitaker plot. So using this approach, we can check out how the range of climate futures from the first graph map onto that biome space. The Kenai Refuge keeps rainforest, but the boreal biome becomes warm enough to move into temperate seasonal forest. Some places warm, but don't get enough precipitation to be temperate forest in terms of its climate space, and instead shift to woodland shrubland space. This isn't meant to be an accurate prediction of vegetation change. Rather, it's a fuzzy way to consider a future that's different from the past. a beam shining into the unknowable future. Another approach was done by SNAP, which is our Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Using their downscale data and GCMs that work best in Alaska, a clustering algorithm was used to sort the historical downscale data into groups that are similar. SNAP included more information about monthly and seasonal temperatures and precipitation in its models. When 18 clusters were used, they mapped out well onto existing biomaps for Alaska and Canada. Again, the Kenai shows up as Southern Boreal and Pacific Maritime Rainforest. So we can see that we do sit on that Boreal Maritime Forest threshold, or not threshold, but we span that space. The little yellow dot is a harbinger of the future. The 1961 to 1990 30-year average spans the period when climate change had already begun to accelerate in Alaska. The yellow dot expands in the future time steps, but all GCMs and emission scenarios modeled show the boreal lowlands of the Western Kenai shifting to a climate that was associated with Saskatchewan grasslands. This is a climate future with warm, dry summers and cold winters. SNAP's climate models show a different biome future than the Whitaker plots, which forecast more temperate forest and less grassland shrubland in the lowlands. Perhaps the GCM SNAP use have less precipitation, or perhaps the inclusion of seasonal variables gave it a little bit different information than the simple Whitaker plots. In yet another approach, Diana Strahlberg used a random forest model to empirically link ecoregions to bioclimatic climate variables. Bioclimatic variables include even more information that is thought to be important to ecosystems, such as extremes in evapotranspiration. With this data, the relative stability of the Pacific Maritime remains. Therefore, this map shows all the ecoregions that show up on the Kenai lowlands in 4 climate futures representing 2 time steps and 2 emission scenarios. The minimum and maximum acreage for each ecoregion across the 4 climate futures is written on the arrows to get a sense of whether the ecoregion has an increasing, decreasing, or unknown direction in terms of climate signal. Please note that I'm still wrapping my mind around how the climates of these ecoregions look in comparison to the Kenai lowlands, but in general, there are climate futures where the warmer and much wetter associated climate with the wetter climate associated with the Pacific Maritime Forest makes it over the rain shadow caused by the Kenai Mountains. Other climate futures are more closely associated with northwestern forested mountains of the Rocky, or forested mountains similar to the Rocky Mountains. If the climate future is warm with only a slight increase in precipitation that is swamped by evapotranspiration, the climate of the lowlands might look more like the climate associated with grassland, shrublands, or dry woodlands. And the least likely, but still possible, is that the climate is more similar to coastal cold forests of the eastern North America. This is far away and a weak signal in terms of the number of climate futures it shows up in and the acreage that is forecast to be associated with these forest types. But I'm still exploring the climate signals for this one. So we know that the climate of the boreal lowlands is moving away from what is associated with the boreal forest biome. And what is emerging may not be a good analog to the ecosystems that are close or next door. So we might be a trailing edge with no leading edge in terms of the climate signal. But this doesn't give us insight into how change might unfold in our particular landscape. How change unfolds will be constrained by events like dispersal. The peninsula geography requires natural dispersers to find their way across an 11-mile isthmus. Additionally, because the analogs are not adjacent, the dispersal might be difficult from these distant places. So we have to ask, is the Kenai fated to be a trailing edge with no leading edge? In other words, a depauperate species assemblage. So this is where we go back to scenario planning. So we just talked about beams, and now we're going to think about paths. Paths can help us to explore and communicate how these different features might actually happen in our path-dependent and contingent landscape. The paths identify the conditions and events, like disturbances, that are highly influential in a particular ecosystem and landscape context. They acknowledge the historical legacies and geographic reality of the lands that we're actually managing. The symbols in this figure are meant to communicate contingency events that move the ecosystem in different directions. For example, a hot, dry fire or extreme flood event. They represent stochastic events that will shape the future. These are contingencies, defined as events that are plausible, but difficult to predict in terms of timing. The paths communicate, if this happens, then the ecosystem moves in this direction. This could help us evaluate if we're monitoring metrics that will help us identify which direction the climate is moving and which ecosystems will be aligned with the emerging climate. For the boreal forest, we're lucky to have information about how conditions and events shape ecological outcomes. For example, a regime shift between spruce-dominated and deciduous-dominated forest is mediated by fire intensity. Spruce can also shift to herbaceous grassland in the interior Alaska when hot fires or reburning exhausts the seed source, and no deciduous seeds are available. So that's the spruce seed source. In the landscape, so when there's no deciduous seeds in the landscape. On the Kenai, deciduous trees are common and well distributed. However, we have experienced a forest to grassland transition that's different than what's being experienced in interior Alaska. Our contiguous spruce forest, which remember is that hybrid of boreal white and maritime Sitka spruce, experienced a stand level mortality event from spruce beetles. The beetle disturbance killed the trees, opening the canopy, but left the ground cover intact. Sun-loving blue joint grass had enough water to become dominant in the years following the beetle event. These thick grass mats choke out seedlings and can burn in the spring. So this spring burning is a qualitatively new fire regime that has the potential to reinforce grassland conditions. So we have that information, but today for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on how changes to the species assemblage in a place that has high climate velocity and also has issues with connectivity. So that's the Kenai, right? Changes to the species assemblage are also contingencies that are very difficult to predict. So this is a photo of turkeys in Ninilchik that was photographed by Daisy Ting in 2021. Hunters release game species here for sport hunting in the summer. In the past, any that were not taken would not survive the harsh winter. Now our winters are milder and some species, such as ringneck pheasant, can survive some winters. It seems likely like only a matter of time before more individuals from more species can survive here and colonize the Kenai. This highlights the reality that humans have and will continue to shape our future species assemblage. In 1985, caribou were captured from the Nelchina herd and trucked 325 miles to the Kenai Peninsula. Caribou had been extirpated in 1912 from the entire peninsula. These extirpated animals were likely boreal woodland caribou. So Cecil Jones, a rancher from Homer's, pictured here helping to move these lowland caribou that were released in the Caribou Hills. The caribou established a population, but quickly moved away from the Kenai, or from the Caribou Hills and into the Kenai Mountains. So when we're thinking about what to do, we can consider strategies that resist, accept, or direct changes to the species assemblage. Resist uses intervention to maintain and restore historical condition. Most of us have been trained to do this, and much of invasive species management is focused here. Accept is the choice not to intervene and allow ecological change to unfold autonomously. Direct uses intervention to actively shape ecological conditions towards a different state that it's aligned with the emerging climate. Direct can be uncomfortable because we are not certain about the future we would be directing to, but we are more certain about what the historical conditions were. There are risks and challenges to each in terms of managing the future species assemblage. The RAD framework is value neutral because resisting, accepting, and directing will make sense in different contexts. In a rapidly changing climate, the status quo of resisting change may not be the low-risk strategy because we might lose future opportunity and ultimately increase extinction risks. Accepting also is a choice that has consequence, even if we don't make that choice explicit. Direct is new territory, and I struggle with how to know which species and futures should be invested in. So I wanted to check in with Kurt here and see if this is a good time to check in with questions, or if you had a different spot where you were thinking about checking in, or if you want me just to go through to the end.
Dawn, I think you can continue. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't have many questions in the queue for you, so I think you can continue.
All right, well, I'll just motor on, but feel free to stop if you want to chime in with some discussion.
Will do.
Okay. So direct begs this question. In a rapidly changing climate, do we have frameworks to think about what options and futures are good investments for refuges? Chris Thomas from University of York is a leader for thinking about conservation strategies for a dynamic world. This talk is already centered on the idea that ecological systems are non-stationary and that we can no longer separate humans and nature in the Anthropocene. In his writing, he also argues that the Anthropocene is a selective pressure. Some species will decline, but others will thrive. The new conditions, such as novel habitats and species interactions, will also generate new species. Focusing on biodiversity can give us a path forward. The Millennium Assessment recognizes biodiversity as an ecosystem service. Biodiversity provides future opportunity because it contains the building blocks for the future world, even if we cannot know what that world will be. Rare species may be common species in the future, so we don't want to lose the parts globally. And I linked here Dr. Thomas's on Talk of Alaska because it was a really rich discussion, and I was just really delighted and surprised by it. And that was the first time I was exposed to his work. So just giving everyone a shout out that you never know where, you know, if you show up and give talks to where those things will go, because I really appreciated hearing him on our local station. So biodiversity might give us a conceptual vantage point, but this does not imply that biodiversity can be the only thing valued. We still need actions like carbon mitigation and nature-based solutions to stay within planetary bounds. We want resilient and robust ecosystems. Human needs and well-being are also important and necessary to address. For refuges in Alaska, subsistence and cultural ties to the land are important, and communities that will be affected by the choices of refuge managers need to have a voice in decision-making. Dr. Thomas believes that we should promote biodiversity gains while minimizing loss. I've been on board with the idea of minimizing global extinction for a long time, but I have to say that Dr. Thomas sort of blew my mind with his argument for how we might be gaining species in the Anthropocene. Even though minimizing species loss is not a new idea, some of the approaches given climate change are not congruent with how we have approached conservation when we assume stability. We can protect in place where feasible, but we need to ask questions about how effective we can be in order to transition to options that are truly feasible in the future climate. He suggests questioning, will efforts make a difference in 100 years? And will people several generations in the future be bothered by the change? So such options include moving threatened and endangered species to new locations. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is currently developing guidelines for translocating species. We can also infuse genes that will increase the adaptive capacity of species. In some cases, these may be novel hybrids or even use domestic animals, which is the case of bison and cows, and that was controversial. The concept of triage in making choices to invest in maintaining branches of the tree of life, even if we lose twigs, is also in play here. So the last two ideas for minimizing extinction and the idea that hybridization can create species shifts is related to how I have conceptualized the tree of life up till now. I sort of thought of it as, the branches go out and then they end. Dr. Thomas makes the point that the idea of distinct branches was always a little bit off. A more apt analogy would be a thicket of converging and diverging information. For example, polar bears still carry brown bear genes, and now as the ice moves further offshore, leaving polar bears stranded on the land, brown and polar bears are hybridizing more and more often. Dr. Thomas argues with many examples that interactions with new species and the hybridizations that result, and also the new ecological situations in the Anthropocene, ultimately will create new species. These situations create separation, either geographic or behavioral, that will allow various selection pressures to create separate species. So island archipelagos are species makers because they separate individuals under different selective pressures than are experienced on the mainland. For example, white-eyes in the Pacific Islands have speciated into 80 species. Distinct habitats like lakes or mountaintops can also act as islands. Perhaps the new selective pressure in the Anthropocene will create as many species as they end. But there's a warning about timescale. Human timescales are so short as compared to evolutionary time. The United States is just under 250 years old, and refuges plan in 15-year cycles. We're going to need to proceed with caution given this massive time mismatch. So it is fair to ask, are we ready to move these ideas into action? It will challenge worldviews about nature and conservation practices. Can we trust nature to work it out, or must we help nature? Are the practices well established, and do we know how to do it? Do we just need to develop new methods, or do some new ideas require that we test the underlying assumptions to understand if it even makes sense? I just made this graph up to try to map out the landscape of accepting and directing species assemblages. In the left lower corner, the ideas of conserving nature's stage is well established. Creating a connected conservation network makes sense, and we know how to do it. But will its reliance on trusting that species can resort naturally increase global extinction more than options where we help species? Translocations could help in these cases, and we have a history where we know how to do it, species by species. But what about translocating entire assemblages? We have had some bad experiences with that idea, like in an accidental sense, when a pathogen travels with its host. The idea of loading a system with every species that may be possible in the future climate and letting the novel system emerge from the chaos, rewilding, genetic engineering, and de-extinction are all really controversial. How should we manage a place like the Kenai lowlands where we are likely to keep most species, but also seem to have the potential to host many more in the future? So I made this graph up too. It's an attempt to think about ways we could move forward on the Kenai across the resist, accept, direct framework. On the resist side, we could continue to label what shows up as invasive and assume that what is here has the adaptive capacity to make it in the new climate conditions. We could try to maintain the geographic separation of the Kenai Peninsula to maintain the genetic diversity that's resulted from the relative isolation to date. Alternatively, we could enhance the adaptive capacity of species currently here by translocating individuals or genes from climates that are similar to the emerging climate. Another approach that sort of is in between resisting and accepting would be to decide on a case-by-case basis if we should accept new species that show up. This is what we are currently doing. And so I apologize, I can't remember the species name, but we had a little plant show up on our oil field, and our botanist and entomologist, Matt Bowser, every time he sees a new species, he looks it up, and it turns out it was threatened and endangered in British Columbia. So should we allow that species and others that aren't endangered, should we take them out quickly? On the direct side, we can identify species that are local losers and translocate them out to places where they would be more likely to thrive. We could also translocate species in for a few or many species, like in that example of trying to species load, just to see if we could what max diversity would look like on the Kenai Peninsula. So I'm now going to try to share an attempt to apply these ideas about minimizing biodiversity loss and promoting biodiversity gains to the Kenai Refuge. So first, I think about how different the wildlife assemblages of the forecast regions are as compared to what is here now. And so using just maps of distribution, this is our current carnivore assemblage. And we know these species are here. The percentage indicates how many of the current and future ecoregions overlap with the historical range of the species. There are 15 ecoregions in play, so black bear have historically been distributed in all of our current and future climate associated ecoregions. It looks like we could be a stronghold for the current carnivore assemblage. And 16 additional species could make it here in the future. I know that red fox were extirpated from the Kenai during the fur trade days in the early 1900s, though sometimes we have sightings reported. There are also unconfirmed and rare sightings of cougars. So that's the question marks there for those two species. It's a similar story for our ruminant ungulates, of which we have 4 species. An additional 6 species could potentially make it here in the future. Mule deer get a question mark because 7 Sitka deer, a subspecies of mule deer, were released on the Homer Spit in 1923. They soon disappeared, but every once in a while, we also get a sighting reported. They are also good swimmers and could occur in Prince William Sound, so perhaps it's just a matter of time. Mule deer have also been moving into Alaska in the interior since the 1970s and have even made it into the hunting regulations. Elk have been translocated successfully onto Kodiak Island in the 1920s. And I mentioned Kodiak because it's closer to the Kenai than the population in Southeast Alaska. Bison are also closer than one might imagine. There's a population of plains bisons on the Copper River. These bison came from 23 animals translocated in 1928 to the Delta River from the National Bison Range in Montana. The herd grew to 400 animals, and individuals were translocated to the Copper River Chittenden, and Farewell River in the 1950s. Another fun story is that of wood bison walking across the Canadian-US border to the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in 1988. They were charging sheds and creating dangerous conditions on the highway. So in 1989, refuge staff loaded them onto a trailer and sent them home. What about trees? So Alaska's tree diversity is still slowly rebounding post-glaciation. So we don't have that many tree species as it is. We've seen a forest to grassland transition that could be transitory or stable, depending on if the spring grass-fed fires burn every 5 to 10 years. Diana Stralberg used a climate envelope modeling approach that included weighting based on how far away the historical range was from the future forecasts. So we can use her models of 324 tree species to think about it if it's likely that we can maintain forests and how diverse those forests will be. This map shows the average refugia score for the 324 species in 2050 under the high emission scenario. High scores are green and indicate that more tree species have high refugia scores. The Kenai seems likely to have a climate that will be suitable for a forest that's more diverse than what we host today. In fact, 76 tree species may, according to her models, be able to survive here given climate change. All of our current species, sorry, I don't know if I hope you guys can see that it's like a light green on those, seem to remain within their climate envelope in the future, though not every local species was modeled. So for example, you can see 4 salix species or willow species that are noted that we have on the refuge, but they weren't included in the 325 model. So I created this dendrogram to visualize the phylogenetic diversity that could be hosted for the future. And 2 of these species, 2 species have already naturalized on the Kenai Peninsula. So lodgepole pine and Siberian larch, noted below because she only modeled species from North America, they're here, they're making it, and they're also putting out seedlings that are recruiting. Chokecherry, which is in that yellow color, is also naturalized, but currently being treated as an invasive species. It's toxic for moose if they eat it. And the upper picture shows people from our local Kenai Watershed Forum, a great nonprofit working on a removal project. And many other species in that light yellow have already been imported and planted across the Kenai Peninsula. So in the picture is yellow cedar, which is in decline across its historical range in Southeast Alaska due to changing in snow timing and in depth that insulates the roots interacting with more freeze events. So the species status assessment for yellow cedar, which is in regional decline, notes that it might make sense to move them onto the Kenai, and people already have. So this human imported diversity is idling on the landscape and may be ready to take advantage of the opening climate niche, but is currently being decided by, what gets here gets decided by forestry groups, plant vendors like Home Depot, and local landowners. And so it's an open question of whether people who care about conservation should be also encouraging planting these phylogenetic holes, right? So species that maybe could make it and just aren't here yet. Should we encourage plants from within the continent as opposed to from other continents like the Siberian larch? One thought for that is that the likelihood of pests and pathogens being unleashed might be higher when things are moving across continents. So for example, in this picture, of birch leaf miners, they came from root wads of birch imported from Europe. So the leaf miner made it, but the parasitoid assemblage that controls birch miners in Europe didn't make it. And now we're experiencing stand level regional outbreaks in Alaska. So this all begs the question of what action should we take to prepare and manage a landscape that will hold current species and also maybe be hospitable for many more. So this question of like, if we could hold more biodiversity, should we do that, given that climate change may allow us to do that? And it's just the dispersal limitations that are not allowing that to happen. And if we do that, what are the rules? What are the sideboards for that? I want to note that we're well positioned to understand and potentially shape the species assemblage because we partnered with and leveraged the Forest Inventory and Assessment Program, which is just being stood up everywhere in Alaska. So it's not available everywhere in Alaska as a note. As part of our long-term ecological monitoring program. So the refuge extended the FIA sampling grid into non-forested areas and added species like bird, arthropod, and lichen occurrence data onto the information collected by FIA. So this provides empirical information that can be flexibly pulled depending on what you're looking at about the historical species assemblage. And it drives other remote sensing and modeling projects, as well as it can contextualize research and other things. And so I also want to note that we've put this, this information into GBIF and iNaturalist to try to make it available to others as well.
Dawn, this is Kurt. We have about 8 minutes left and we're starting to get some questions coming in. So I wanted to.
Okay, well, that's great because this can be my last stride because I just wanted to say that these are early developmental stages, but we're starting to ask these questions about what experiments and pilot projects do we need at this point to be prepared. So, are there trigger points we can think about, like a low population threshold or a recruitment failure where we would know we need to act, but then what would we need to know what to do? And so these are just some ideas I threw up that we can use for discussion, and I'll turn it over to you, Kurt, for those questions.
Thanks, Dawn. Very thought-provoking presentation. We've got a whole range of questions that started coming in most of the way through your talk, but there's some basic objective ones. Was Alaska Game and Fish and Wildlife Service involved in the turkey and caribou introductions, or was this more citizen science?
So it's both. So the state was involved with the caribou, and right now the state is also translocating wood bison within its historical range, though we don't fall within that historical range. And they're doing it within the historical range when there's a community that would like that introduction. So those are the two pieces. The game birds, they are just citizens. So it's more akin to people going to Home Depot and liking a plant that's from Norway and putting it in their yard.
Thank you. Next question. I realize sea level rise will be mitigated in the Kenai to a degree, but was sea level rise considered in the models that predicted potential habitat outcomes in the Kenai? If so, how did it affect understanding of the future?
So we are in a different position than, say, East Coast marsh, which is sinking. So we had a big earthquake in 1964, and we are still experiencing isostatic rebound from that. So our land is still raising up. And so, and that rate seems to be happening faster than the sea levels rising at this point in time. And so sea level rise here is less of an issue. The bigger issue is for people's houses. We're having more winter storm events that some of the coasts are cliffy, and erosion events can happen there.
Thank you. how might the concept of shifting baselines in expectations for biodiversity conservation be incorporated over human generations in our planning for future ecological communities?
So that's the question I think I'm posing, because I don't know how to do that exactly. And I'm starting to, I think we have a lot of soul searching to do as a profession. Because, when we think of things as stable, it makes sense that we can look at what we have and keep it. But this idea of change and whether we could host more biodiversity and manage in that way, that's a really different way of thinking. And so there's that piece of the what does success look like, which is almost a worldview level question, right? And then the piece of the second piece of that is, and how do we do it? And I think about the scenarios in the way I do, because I'm not sure people are going to act in anticipation, but I think we can, when we see things coming over the horizon, give ourselves more of a window of opportunity to respond. But there's this paradox of, we can't act until we know it's real or the climate direction is there, or else we could put something in that just isn't quite ready for it. So in the Kenai, we're waiting in real time to see if that spring grass-fed fire happens enough that grassland becomes a stable ecological type on the landscape. Otherwise, it's just delayed succession. And not knowing that makes it hard to decide, but we can think about what point will we know, and are we collecting the right information to know that's happening? And then we can also flesh out, if it is, what are our options? So if that grassland system starts to happen, how would we think about, right now it would be a monoculture, mostly blue joint, though that's not entirely true. And the best dispersers would be coming off of tire wheels. So it could be an invasive assemblage. So we could ask the questions at that point, does it make sense for us to diversify that grassland and also add functional components like bison, a grazer, to niche diversify and allow that grassland to host more diversity, or else we might be left with a depauperate grassland. And it's that worldview level part where is that, do we care more about autonomous response, that ecosystems have autonomy, or do we care more about hosting a lot of biodiversity? Those are really hard questions.
Thanks, Dawn. I think you kind of got at the next question, which is really a comment, but you might want to comment back on. It says, what seems missing here is consideration for species-specific key ecological functions, ecosystem and biodiversity impacts of, for example, browsing, cavity excavation, pollination, burrowing, and much more. I think you kind of touched on that with your last response, but if you wanted to elaborate, and this will probably be the last question we're going to be able to take, I think, because I have to give Jim some time, I think, to wrap up.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for facility. Yeah, I think that question is really provocative and well-centered, and it still hits those same points of, we could niche diversify and maybe hold more to biodiversity, but do we want to, or do we want to keep that historical fidelity? But I do think that what the person said really does offer a path forward. And we have a PhD student, Tracy Melvin. She got married, and I hope that's her current name. I'm sorry, Tracy, if I got that wrong. I'm having a mind blank because I'm on screen. I'm like a deer in the headlights. But yeah, she's asking some of those questions, like what would it look like to niche diversify? And so I'm very excited for her work to be, to see her thoughts when her writing is complete.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Dawn. There are certainly a few more interesting questions there, and I think you'll probably have an opportunity to take a look at those after and perhaps respond in some way, shape, or form. You've gotten a lot of comments and chats that are thank you for a great and thought-provoking presentation. So I want to thank you a lot for doing this presentation for us, Dawn. And I don't know whether Jim wraps this up or Amanda wraps this up, but I'm going to give them a chance to weigh in here and bring us home.
Well, and while we wait out, just thanks to everybody, and thanks for facilitating, and to this group for hosting. It's nice to have these places to talk about these issues.
Yep, no, just a reminder, this will be posted on that website that we shared earlier on this webinar that I can reshare again. Thank you all for joining, and thank you so much, Dawn, for that presentation.